What is going on, Wastelanders? It is me, Lone Vault Wanderer, here with a response video to an article that was written by Eric Kane on the Forbes website, the link to which you can find in the description below. And essentially it's entitled The 5 Biggest Problems with Fallout 4. And I want to address Eric Kane's article in every regard with all of the 5 points that he states. And I think this is important to start an open dialogue and a conversation. I agree with some of what he says, I also disagree with some of what he says, but I would love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments below once you listen to my video and once you read his article. So he first starts off by saying that there's really no excuse for the graphics. He believes that Fallout 4 looks low rent, and while he is not a graphics purist in his opinion, he thought that the game would look better essentially. But he is inclined to agree with an opinion that the game's graphics don't necessarily matter, but he does point out that the lip syncing and the animations are worse, the character models are dated, the engine's antiquated, so the entire presentation in his opinion is just mediocre at best. Now, I've addressed this in the past and I'll address it again. The Fallout franchise has never been one for super realistic graphics. Never. Go back to the original Fallout games, go to Fallout 3, go to Fallout New Vegas, but nevertheless, I don't think the graphics look bad. In my review, I refer to the graphics as stylized with a cartoonish touch, and I still think that applies here. The game is obviously not going for this super realistic design, and for example, when people looked at Bioshock Infinite, no one ever said that the game looked bad, but I think Bioshock Infinite and Fallout 4 share a very, very similar graphical design, maybe even to Rage as well, but some of these comparisons to modern day games out there I think are a bit unfair. Of course, the game does not look as good as them, but that does not mean the graphics look bad, in my opinion anyways. But I will agree with him that the lip syncing and the animations are worse, they are a bit dated and they need to be fixed. I mentioned many different glitches. In my playthrough of Fallout 4, I would see some lip animations that were completely out of sync, I would hear some voice dialogue but I wouldn't see the lip moving at all, and even when it did work, in my opinion, it wasn't completely natural. So I do agree with him in that regard. Secondly, he says that the game is a buggy mess at launch, and he says that Bethesda kind of gets a free pass for its buggy games, particularly at launch, and he's saying that there's really no excuse for this stuff. Buggy, laggy, unreliable frame rate, and potentially game-breaking crashes. He's saying that it's not the state that a game should be released in, and he doesn't think that Bethesda should get a free pass. Now, I've mentioned that there are bugs in the game. Don't get me wrong, I never personally experienced game-breaking bugs. I know that people out there have. But when I played the game at the very least for 40 hours, the bugs were not game-breaking and it did not hinder my experience. And I understand his concerns with games being released out there with this kind of expectation that bugs will be fixed eventually, and perhaps that's something that should be addressed in the gaming industry, but I can only speak for myself here that in my playthrough of the game, it did not affect my experience negatively. I saw the bugs and I was admittedly a little bit acceptant of that, but again, I still enjoyed the game thoroughly, even with the bugs that were existent. Thirdly, Eric says that the conversations are lousy. He says that the conversations are essentially a charisma-based random numbers game, and he says that you don't know what your dialogue choices will necessarily end up saying, since the choices don't precisely mirror your character's actual utterance. He's of the opinion that this transforms conversations and their outcomes into a game of guesswork rather than playing a role and making tough choices. And he's saying it's a shame too because the voice acting is pretty good, a huge step up from Skyrim. I do agree with that last point. The game's voice acting is very good. Brian and Courtney did a fantastic job with the voice acting, but I don't necessarily agree with him that the charisma-based random numbers game that he describes is a wrong or a bad thing. In fact, Fallout has always been like that. In Fallout 3 in New Vegas, you had a speech skill and you had a certain percentage chance of a particular speech challenge being successful. They haven't touched that formula because I believe, in my opinion, that it works. Speech challenges should not always work in all cases. That's why they're speech challenges. Yes, you can get a high charisma to improve your chances, but it's not always going to be effective and it's not always going to be successful for you, but that's the entire intention of it. And also he says that because of the briefness of the dialogue descriptions in the 4-choice wheel, you don't know what the character is actually going to go on to say. But in my review, I said that I was rarely ever surprised as to what the character actually said. Of course, it's kind of inconsistent with traditional role-playing elements because typically you would know exactly what the character is going to say to the person that you're speaking to, but now you're selecting an option and then hearing that dialogue in full before ever really being given a chance to say, oh, I actually agree with everything that was just said and I wanted that to be said or spoken to the person I'm speaking to. Or alternatively, I actually didn't want that to happen and I would have preferred selecting a different option with the benefit of hindsight. So honestly, it just depends what your cup of tea is. I personally didn't mind it. I liked the fact that I could just sit back, relax. It was a bit more cinematic. It wasn't, reading a bunch of lines of text like in past Fallout games, and I would become fixated on text as opposed to actually looking at the person I was talking to, which I think is really important. Fourthly, he says that combat needs to be better, even though this isn't a traditional shooter. He's saying, yes, the gunplay is better than what it was in Fallout 3, but the entire system leaves a great deal to be desired. I think he actually says that the slowed down VATS mode rather than pause and play is a negative thing. At least that's my interpretation of what he's saying. And then he goes on to say that VATS feels more like a crutch than smart game design, and that this isn't a game that needs to be all about combat all the time, but when it is about combat, the shooting mechanics should be a lot more fun and a lot more polished. I do disagree with him. Not only in my opinion is the combat vastly improved over Fallout 3, I actually think it's really smooth and really effective. Yes, it's not your typical Call of Duty 60 FPS buttery smooth, really fast trigger action gameplay. It's obviously not that, but I still think it's very solid. And while he says that combat needs to be better even though this isn't a traditional shooter, I think you can't hide from that fact. This isn't a traditional shooter, it is an action RPG that has shooting elements. We need to remember that at the core. But Bethesda, even with those traditional notions, have still gone on to try and improve the combat. And I think it is fun, it is effective, it is smooth, and because of all those improvements, I was relying less and less on VATS in Fallout 4 compared to my playthroughs of Fallout 3 in New Vegas. And that was definitely one of the negatives that many people spoke out about in their playthroughs of past Fallout games. And then finally he says, in the end, it's more of the same, even with all of these changes, some for the better, some for the worse. Fallout 4 feels far too much like its predecessor. The new base building mechanic isn't nearly as fun or rewarding as it should be, but he admits that nostalgia isn't necessarily a bad thing, and nor is innovation necessarily good, but he can't help but think that more could have been done to make the game stand out. He says that Bethesda is resting on its laurels that may not be as solid or reliable as they once were thanks to the rise of serious competition. It's been 7 years since Fallout 3 after all. Now, I agree with him in some senses. Of course, Fallout 4 feels like Fallout 3. I mean, it's the sequel, it's the same franchise. You expect it to feel like its past game. Now, admittedly, I didn't use the settlement building system a lot as well. While I won't go so far as to say that it isn't fun or rewarding as it should be, I haven't used it enough to form that opinion and give a solid thought on it, so I want to leave that aside for now. But I do think Fallout 4 feels very different to Fallout 3. And this is coming from someone that has literally just played Fallout 3 consistently before Fallout 4 actually launched. And I think the game feels different enough. I think the world looks different, the color palette looks different, the graphics look different, the weapons are different, the armor is different, we have a new power armor system. There are a lot of changes over Fallout 3, but of course, this is just a matter of subjective personal opinion. No one can objectively say that Fallout 4 is exactly the same as Fallout 3, and no one can objectively say that Fallout 4 isn't the same as Fallout 3. It just depends what you think. I just simply disagree with him. Eric has his own thoughts, and I respect him for that. So anyways, Wastelanders, that is all from me. Again, please put your thoughts in the comments below with regards to my video and with regards to Eric's article. I would love to hear what you think. And until next time, this has been the Lone Vault Wanderer. Please take care of yourself. And as always, keep fighting the good fight.